What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. And today, we're continuing our trip around the NBA, getting an inside look at some of the league's most fascinating teams through the eyes of the reporters who cover them every single day. And we're staying out west to talk about a team that has become particularly relevant to the Cleveland Cavaliers over the last few weeks, the Denver Nuggets. And I'm joined by Bennett Durando of the Denver Post, who covers the team from the Mile High City. Bennett has been along for the ride during some of the organization's most consequential moments in recent history, including the aftermath of their championship in 2023, the franchise front office overhaul in 2025, and now the incredibly complicated challenge of trying to keep a championship caliber roster around one of the greatest players we've ever seen. And there may not be a better time to have Bennett on this show because Cleveland and Denver have become intertwined this offseason. The Cavs just acquired Peyton Watson from the Nuggets. As you all know, we've talked about this massive 5-team sign-and trade with Peyton Watson ultimately signing a 4-year, $88 million contract to join the Cleveland Cavaliers. Denver walked away from the deal with a 2031 unprotected first-round pick and a 2032 second-round pick while shedding the financial burden that came with keeping Peyton Watson. So I want to start there, Bennett. From your perspective, what actually happened between Peyton Watson and Denver? Because from the outside looking in, Peyton Watson just had the best season of his career thus far, became eligible for a significant payday, and Denver had severe financial restrictions, which ultimately forced them to decide what the team could justify giving him. What was the reality behind the scenes, and is there more about Peyton Watson that the Cavs fan base should know about heading into training camp?
Well, Ethan, the story of Peyton Watson and the Nuggets is kind of complex to evaluate because, on one hand, you have to look at the last 4 years and him even getting to a point where he could negotiate for this type of contract with Cleveland as a resounding success, considering he was the 30th overall pick in his draft class. So he gets taken at the very end of the first round with a pick that often does not pan out in the NBA. That's just the reality of it. And so, by one perspective on this, you have Watson as kind of a success story for Denver's player evaluation and player development over those 4 years. And yet, at the same time, there's this feeling in Denver of what could have been with Peyton Watson, I think, as the book closes on his 4-year chapter here. So it's really fascinating because he was the subject of internal strife for a lot of his rookie contract. He's a champion. He's an NBA champion, but he spent most of that rookie season when Denver won the title closer to Cleveland than he did to Denver, honestly, with the Grand Rapids Gold, Denver's G League affiliate. They wanted to be patient with him. They took him in the same draft class as Christian Brown, and those two kind of end up, intertwined and kind of the arcs of their careers so far and where they go from here, where Christian is this plug and play out of a national championship team in college, sort of super utility guy who came in and was, a seventh man championship contributor in the rotation as a rookie. And Peyton Watson was kind of it's a yin yang where he was this upside bet who they felt like they could send to the G League and play the long game with because he barely played in his 1 year at UCLA and took a major bet on himself by entering the draft after barely playing as a one and done guy in college. So it was kind of difficult to figure out what he was going to be in the NBA just based on that alone. Over the years, I don't think they quite knew what to do with him. The rift between Michael Malone and Calvin Booth has been well documented. Obviously, that I think one of the sort of key moments that goes to show how split Denver was internally about him at times was his second year when he plays most of the playoff series against Minnesota in the second round, as an end of the rotation type of guy. And then he's a DMP coach's decision in game 7 of that series. So you have Calvin Booth, who was very upset at Michael Malone not using Peyton Watson at the end of this series, which kind of notoriously ends with the Nuggets blowing a 20-point second half lead at home in what could have been a championship year maybe for them in 24. And then on the other side, you have Malone, who does not trust him in this game 7 stage, and then advocating behind the scenes that Peyton Watson should have been on the Summer League team going into his third year in the league. And so that, that just goes to show kind of the difference that there was in terms of how Denver was kind of evaluating him over the years. They were trying to figure out how to use him offensively. Malone was even using him as a small ball five at times, as kind of a role man, just to put a little bit of extra athleticism on the floor when Denver had issues at backup five. I think Peyton Watson always viewed himself as someone who could handle a larger role with the ball and could at the very least be a 15-point per game slasher off of the wing instead of mostly standing in the corner, 3-and-D guy, a little bit of these kind of all over the place off ball roles that Denver was trying out with him. And so I think over the course of his rookie contract, he kind of became a little bit of a jack of all trades offensively, but a master of no role in those first 3 years in particular. Defensively, obviously a ton of talent on ball, off ball. He's one of the better shot blocking wings in the league, I think, at this point, in addition to kind of what he can do to stay glued to guys. Denver always asked him to study Jaden McDaniels as the type of player to emulate defensively. But it leads to this contract extension decision the Nuggets had to make last offseason between Christian Braun and Peyton Watson, who they're both going into the last year of their rookie deal. They're both extension eligible until the last day of the offseason. Christian Braun has proven more at this point. He's a most improved candidate from his third year. Peyton Watson remains kind of in limbo as this upside that he was when they drafted him 3 years ago. And so Denver chooses Christian Braun with a 5-year deal, average annual value of $25 million. Peyton goes into restricted free agency. And, it kind of sets up this offseason where the writing was on the wall going into last season that they might lose Peyton Watson. And I think they were prepared for that because they were looking at a second apron situation. They had sort of a 1-year mini window within the larger window that is Jokic's prime, where both Braun and Watson are at a cheap salary in their fourth year. And then you had Aaron Gordon at a $22 million salary before incurring a $10 million raise essentially going into next season. So they understood that they had a better payroll situation and they were going to get into some second apron trouble in the 2026 offseason. And what they did not foresee, obviously, was Peyton having this breakout month, really, when Jokic was out of the lineup dealing with a knee injury. And, Peyton goes 17 to 20 games, averaging 20 points per game, efficient ISO scorer, sort of a star potential that you always wondered if he had, but just hadn't been unlocked for 3.5 years, really. And suddenly you get this glimpse of this young athleticism and on-ball talent that Denver felt like it really needed, long-term future. And it changed the outlook on trying to potentially keep him. So that was kind of what foregrounded going into this offseason. And yet at the end of the day, they end up with the sign and trade because there were tense contract negotiations here where Peyton fancied himself worth a certain amount, and Peyton's camp certainly, and the Nuggets were trying to play hardball as the incumbent team in the restricted free agency process, which is how we've seen that process go a lot of times over the years. So they reach a standoff, and the Nuggets are ultimately simultaneously kind of evaluating what the trade value might be on different guys on their roster if they were to keep Peyton, because they were going to have to sacrifice someone. And what they decided ultimately was essentially to choose someone else over Peyton Watson for the second consecutive offseason. In this case, Cam Johnson, who's making a very similar salary to what Peyton will make in Cleveland, expiring contract for Cam. Ultimately, they couldn't get the unprotected first in a lot of their other trade options. And so they liked that pick a lot. And that's kind of what led to them kind of ripping off the Band-Aid when they did.
Yeah, don't tell Cavs fans that Mike Malone was using Peyton Watson as a small ball five. They heard Peyton Watson was a 6'8", and they thought, we're getting away from playing fourth guard lineups. We're not going to have a small ball five anymore. Kenny Atkinson's licking his chops.
Look, I don't think that's going to happen in Cleveland at all, but Denver's had a lot of backup center issues over the years. They kind of just decided Peyton, at least he's an above the rim player, so you can theoretically put him in pick and roll as a roll man and give him the opportunity to maybe have some roll gravity, catch lobs, that type of thing. And so that was at a time where they didn't really have a solidified, consistent backup five, and they just wanted to try some stuff. They didn't even do it that much with Peyton, but they've used him as a four a lot. I don't even think that Peyton Watson ever really envisioned himself as a four, as kind of a pure power forward. I think he thinks of himself more as a pure wing, a 3 or a 2 even, who can have that positional size and play both sides of the ball. So I would be pretty surprised if the Cavs were using him that way. But how they use him will be really interesting because that's a major part of the story of his first 4 years in the NBA is, the Nuggets trying to figure out what they could do with him. And Watson certainly having an idea of what he could do over the course of those years and then getting to show it for at least a small sample size during his fourth year.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why the fan base can be seen as somewhat split when it comes to the Cavs and getting this deal done, right? Obviously, we have the biggest issue, which is giving up an unprotected first round pick, but also understanding that Peyton Watson is unproven, as you mentioned. And then also not to mention that the Cleveland Cavaliers had to get off of Max Strus, who was a veteran leader of vocal presence for the locker room as well. So I wanted to pick your brain on this entire situation. Obviously, the 5-team deal is a lot to unpack, but when you look at that final transaction, when you look at the reaction from the fan base, do you think that Denver got what it needed out of this deal? Or to put it even more plainly, of the 5 teams involved in the trade, which would you deem as the winner?
It's a good question. If you ask the fans in Denver, they're not thrilled about the trade. I'll tell you that. Inherently, when you're in a championship window with an all time great and you make a trade where you lose a rotation player, a talented player, and you don't get a player back, that is going to get people up in arms a little bit. And so, Denver, this was a situation where the Nuggets did not have a lot of draft capital. They've really mortgaged their future over the last few years, and they've tried to start recouping some of that this summer, both during the draft when they traded back into the second round, and now with this, they went from 0 trade eligible first round picks to 1 trade eligible first round pick. So from Denver's perspective, for me, it's difficult to evaluate the trade in full until we know what that pick becomes and sort of what the direction of the team ends up being in the next calendar year in the aftermath of deciding to get rid of Watson, because that pick could be a golden ticket back into ways to help reconstruct the roster a little bit around Jokic and find other ways to build a team that can maybe compete for the title, whether it's this year or in the next few years, assuming Jokic signs his extension, of course. On the other hand, like, they're still over the second apron right now. This was the reality of their situation and why people were never going to be thrilled about the offseason in Denver this year, was because they went into it knowing that if they kept all 5 of their starters from last year and Peyton Watson, they were essentially going to end up with a luxury tax bill twice as much as the record bill that had been paid in NBA history before now. So fans are not going to like that. I'm not here to defend it necessarily, but there are not a lot of owners that would pay the luxury tax bill that the Nuggets were going to have to pay for keeping all of these guys. And so they were always going to be making a salary shedding move this summer. That was part of this from the beginning. It was kind of a matter of who it was going to be between, Cam Johnson, Peyton Watson. Was there an Aaron Gordon trade to be made if they wanted to do something a little more dramatic? Right now, they're standing by the starting 5 from last season despite the first round exit, and the bench is taking a hit without Watson. That's part of the situation for them. So it's hard to look at the roster for Denver and say this is a better team than last season. I don't think that anyone would necessarily argue that it is a better team. And that's an unfortunate reality where inherently, I guess, in the short term, the Nuggets lose the trade. But I think they're really happy with the pick that they got out of it. They think it could turn out to be a really valuable pick. And because of that, it's not like they're looking to hold on to it for 5 years. They're looking to move that thing at some point, whether it's at the trade deadline or next offseason, to find the next move as they continue to build around Jokic. And for Cleveland, like 22 is, we'll see. I think it's a decent deal for Peyton Watson. Obviously, the unprotected pick and the $22.5 million a year is kind of where you squint a little bit and you get worried about how much you're giving up for someone based on a 1-month sample size, really. I think that's what the Nuggets were nervous about. They had some concerns with Peyton that we can get into, certainly, but they did like the player. They were trying to keep the player, and I think he fills a need for Cleveland. It's going to come down to like how they use him in that starting lineup. What's the fit? Can he take on some usage and remain impactful defensively, which is something that we see so many NBA players deal with as their offensive role increases in the league. So on paper, I do really like it for Cleveland. I like the fit there, but it's going to be fascinating to see just kind of how they balance the hierarchy in that starting lineup.
Yeah, I'm in complete agreement with you because when we look at what the Cleveland Cavaliers needed, it was athleticism, youth, wing depth, and defensive versatility. And that's Peyton Watson to a T. There's also still an understanding of what he needs to prove to then become a reliable option for the future because he is young. He is still learning who he is in this league. And also, the fact of the matter is, you pointed it out, he's not necessarily a four, but he's going to play backup 4 minutes for this Cleveland Cavaliers team because you look at the rest of the roster and you're like, well, who else do they have? So Thomas Bryant, you're getting third tier 5 minutes because Evan Mobley's taking the backup center minutes, and then Peyton Watson. You're the only other really true wing 6'8" that can play the power forward position. So as much as Peyton Watson might not believe that he's a four, he's going to be playing that position. And I think it's important that we have continue to have this conversation about where he needs to improve, what you think his area of expertise is, because you know that there's a possibility that he could turn into a Jaden McDaniels, a OG Anunoby-esque kind of player, because I think these are the kinds of archetypes that he fits the mold and fits the build. But I did want to pick your brain, as you mentioned there. What do you feel are the strengths and the weaknesses of Peyton Watson that are going to immediately translate to this Cleveland Cavaliers roster?
He has developed into a really good spot up three-point shooter in the corners over the course of his career so far. So, like, all else fails, you have that, release valve with him where he has shown that he can space the floor a little bit and punish defenses if they don't believe in him as a shooter. That has kind of gradually improved throughout his career. The ball handling stuff is interesting because he was very efficient during that stretch where Jokic was out, and I think it maybe took Jokic being out for him to really have the opportunity to have the ball in his hands that much. The Nuggets don't play a ton of ISO style basketball traditionally in the Jokic era. And so Watson was kind of this interesting stylistic changeup that they could throw a little bit where he felt really comfortable getting to the mid range. He was knocking down some of those shots. He showed that he can actually create for himself off the dribble. I think his handles can still improve. I think that there's some polish that he could put on his actual ball handling just to make that a little tighter. But it's unclear how much he'll actually have those opportunities in Cleveland either. Like, if he's playing in lineups with Harden and Mitchell, how many times is the ball getting to him for him to kind of cook in space? I'm kind of fascinated to see how that'll work. If maybe he's more of a second side creator who can kind of play off of kick out or whatever it may be from Jared Allen or whatever. But certainly you want to see like the on ball stuff kind of continue to flesh out over the course of the next year and the next contract that he's on. Defensively, the Nuggets really valued him, especially after they lost Kentavious Caldwell-Pope a couple of years ago, as someone who could fight over screens a little bit, because that's the one area where Christian Braun has kind of been inconsistent as a lead defensive guard in the league so far. Like, the screen navigation stuff, has not always been his strength as good as he is in ISO defense. So for Peyton, he's someone who can get skinny, who can work over those screens, who can stay glued to the ball. In that way, he's obviously got a ton of length and athleticism. I think the Nuggets really wanted to see him put on more muscle, basically. There's kind of a strength aspect, and can you kind of handle it when you're defending a ball handler who's going to put a shoulder into you to create separation. I think that's kind of the area where the on-ball defense has been tested for him and still needs to take some strides. But obviously there's a lot of talent there in the beginning. And then, like I said, like as a weak side rim protector, really good, really good. His timing is great. Obviously, he's got the hops. If he is defending on the weak side, he just has a great feel for when to come over and help out with a block. Like, he's going to be a fan favorite maybe in that regard, with his ability to be kind of a loud defensive playmaker, I think.
I think that's well said, especially because I did kind of allude to the fact that the Cavs don't have that much depth at the power forward position. Naquan Tomlin still exists, Mario Hezonja still exists, but they're not to that level of what they expect from Peyton Watson. That's why he's immediately going to be the backup power forward. He's going to be the starting small forward. Jalen Tyson, you also could throw in, but I think the defensive versatility is what really stood out to the Cleveland Cavaliers when they were looking at Peyton Watson, because of how he could play next to Jared Allen and or Evan Mobley, because of their defensive prowess and having three different rim protectors and having that help side defense as well. Particularly if they wanted to play with Jared Allen and Peyton Watson together, you now have the initial return and then the help side still, even when Evan Mobley's not on the floor with Jared Allen. So I think that length, that size, that athleticism is going to play into the play style on the defensive end of the floor as much as it will on the offensive end for Kenny Atkinson. But I do want to get nerdy really quickly and talk about some money because I do think it's important that we continue to have this discussion of why the Cavs and the Denver Nuggets are so intertwined, right? Because as we know, last season, the Cleveland Cavaliers were the NBA's most expensive team, deep into the second apron, and had to make some extremely painful financial decisions to escape those restrictions this offseason. Now, Denver is facing a majority of those similar problems. So, do you think that the Denver Nuggets could essentially say, Cleveland just went through this? They survived it, kind of. They made it to the Eastern Conference Finals. Maybe we can take 1 year of pain, get below the aprons, and then start rebuilding around their financial flexibility and Nikola Jokic, depending on his contract situation. Do you see Cleveland as a blueprint for Denver here, or is Denver's situation fundamentally different because of the contract situation with Nikola Jokic?
What's fascinating about it is even if the Nuggets get below the apron here, they're still paying a massive tax bill because they're in the repeater tax, which is this other variable that you're kind of dealing with from the ownership spending standpoint on all this. Like they were in the tax in 23, 24, 25. They got out of it last year, ironically, by giving up a 2031 unprotected first round pick to flip Michael Porter Jr. for Cam Johnson. Like that was a 17 million or so cut to the payroll to help them get under the tax. And the repeater tax rules are that you have to paying the repeater if you finish a season in the tax and had also been in the tax for 3 of the previous 4 years, which sounds unnecessarily complicated. But Denver, in theory, would still need to get out of the tax entirely in order to kind of reset their repeater clock, so to speak. You have the repeater penalties where they're incurring an exponential hit to their tax bill for every dollar that they add to the payroll. And then on top of that, you also get hit with increased tax penalties once you go over each of these apron thresholds. So they had the double whammy of the repeater tax and the second apron. I guess they still technically do. I would be shocked if they don't get under the apron at some point after the Peyton Watson trade, because at this point you're so close to it that you've got to find a way to at some point. But so that's the weird dynamic with this and the Jokic extension situation, where if they really wanted to fully reset and kind of treat this as a gap year of sorts, then what they would do, I would think, would be get out of the tax entirely. That would mean getting rid of Payton for nothing return, and then also finding a way to get off Cam Johnson or Aaron Gordon or Christian Brown or someone like that, or even Jamal Murray, who knows, right? So you have that dynamic where if you wanted to go all in on that, that's how it would be. And yet the specter is there of Jokic going into potentially unrestricted free agency next summer. Now, the Nuggets are extremely confident that he is going to sign the 5-year record-setting contract that he says he's going to sign. He has made no indication at any point in his career in the English language or the Serbian language that he does not want to sign that extension, but it does not stop other teams from licking their lips a little bit when they see one of the best players in the league going into a year that could get kind of dicey. Because, I mean, like, let's say the Nuggets are underperforming in late January and they're in 6th place in the Western Conference, and it doesn't seem like there's a feasible path for them to win the championship suddenly. And you know, they have made themselves worse to some extent this summer by giving up on Peyton Watson without taking a player back. Now, have they kind of given themselves the excuse to get off another player at the trade deadline to get under the tax, or are they in such a pressure cooker situation with Jokic's contract that they can't even consider that? And if they don't, then their repeater clock doesn't reset, and they're still dealing with all this financial strife going into Jokic's next contract. So it's a little trickier for them. I actually, part of me wonders if Jaylen Brown and Boston could become a blueprint for the Nuggets in the future if they get into a really uncomfortable situation, because Boston basically decided they did not want to deal with the extension talks with Jaylen Brown. He's got 3 years left on his deal. There's no player options, no team options. You know who came from the same draft class as Jaylen Brown, is 3 months apart in age from Jaylen Brown, and also has 3 years left on his max contract with no player or team options, is Jamal Murray. So it was just fascinating to me. It raised some antenna, I guess, that they made that trade, which was not a popular PR trade, basically thinking about kind of the future of having 2 massive contracts weighing down your books. I kind of think that's a key element in all of this, where under this current CBA, no team has made the finals with two players occupying more than 60% of the cap. 60% is basically the largest amount that you have the top two contracts on a team making. I think it was exactly 60 for Halliburton and Siakam a year ago, and it was just under 60 for Cat and Anunoby in New York this past season. And obviously, I chuckle there because neither of them are New York's best player. So that's a team that had the cap flexibility to have their second and third best players as their two highest paid players. And even that was kind of rubbing up against kind of the largest amount that we see those two take up. And Jokic and Murray are 65% of the cap right now. It's a super max and a max. Murray just made All NBA. He's technically super max eligible for his next contract. Now, is there going to be an interesting negotiation with the relationship baggage of a 10-year relationship where one side expects you to put a ring on it and you're worried about doing that, right? Like, could that be a situation that we see play out with the Nuggets and Jamal Murray at some point in the next 3 years? Is something that I wonder, just from a zoom out kind of existential crisis standpoint for Denver. And obviously in Cleveland, they just said, screw it, we're going to pay Donovan Mitchell a massive amount and we'll make it work. So the Cleveland Boston elements are actually like two kind of diverging paths, and I'm curious which one the Nuggets will eventually take here with Murray, assuming they end up with Jokic on the books for another 5 years.
Yeah, I think it's extremely interesting, especially when you bring in the Boston Celtics and even New York, right? Because I know Donovan Mitchell didn't take the biggest pay cut, but he could have waited one more summer and then gotten a supermax contract, similar to the one that Nikola Jokic is going to be looking at as well. But when you look at what Jalen Brunson did to allow for the New York Knicks to have their second and third best players be their highest paid players, then you look at what Donovan Mitchell did, and he's taking a pay cut. James Harden taking a pay cut and saying, okay, now is Nikola Jokic going to take a pay cut? I hesitate to believe that would be the case.
Yes, whatever happens, I'm pretty sure that he will not be taking a pay cut.
Yeah, I agree with that. But Bennett, I want to put a pin in the Nikola Jokic conversation. We will circle back to it. I will not forget. But I do want to talk ball real quick. It's my favorite part of the podcast because you've mentioned the hierarchy of the Western Conference. We talk so heavily on this podcast about the hierarchy in the Eastern Conference because I don't think that can get lost in all the salary cap math and apron conversations. All 30 teams have to throw the ball up and hoop for 82 games, right? And a chance to compete in the playoffs, regardless of how taxed they are or how good they are on paper. So I've been saying for weeks and weeks now, I think the Western Conference is more top heavy with the teams like OKC and San Antonio posing to be problems for everyone for years to come. I view the Eastern Conference as deeper with dispersed talent throughout teams on the cusp of contention, while New York wears the crown from last season's championship run. There have been so many different moves this offseason. The East has dramatically gotten stronger. Where do you put Denver in the Western Conference hierarchy right now, especially after adding DeMar DeRozan? Because a few years ago, they were feared as much as OKC. But the Nuggets have slightly tapered off when it comes to playoff success. So maybe the better question is, what would have to happen this season for you to look at Denver and say, okay, they're back to being who they were?
Well, Jokic is such a high floor superstar, right? He's extremely durable. That 1 month injury last year that opens the door for Peyton Watson to get paid as much as he did is the longest sustained absence of Jokic's career for an injury. And it wasn't a soft tissue thing. It was a fluke play with a teammate landing on his knee basically and causing a hyperextension. So you have an extremely durable superstar who you can generally expect to meet the 65 game limit and probably to play 75 if we're being honest. They're going to win a lot of games with him no matter what. And so like I hesitate to drop them too far in the West, especially when you combine that with the fact that it is the less deep conference. I think like the East is clearly deeper at this point. But also the Nuggets are definitely like it's hard to view them as more than a second tier, second rate contender right now, just because of the depth. Just logically, they're coming off of a first round exit to a Minnesota team that was without Anthony Edwards by the end of the series. And Denver fans will yell back at me, well, Aaron Gordon was hurt too, and Peyton Watson was out, which is a major factor kind of in how this summer played out, I think. But Minnesota was missing a more important player. I think that's fair to say. At the end of the day, they lose that series in the first round, and now they're not as deep of a team as they were before. It's hard to look at them seriously within the same tier as OKC and San Antonio. I kind of think that the Minnesota, Lakers, Houston, Denver collection is fairly interchangeable still. I'm fascinated by the LaMelo Ball trade as everyone else is. I do think Minnesota will probably be the team put the highest of those four. But also, I mean, LaMelo Ball's one of the more injury prone stars of the last few years. So that can go sideways. I really think that 3 through 6 is up in the air in the West. And I generally think of Denver as a lock for one of those four spots at least. I think that they have too dependable a superstar. They have enough chemistry, obviously, in the two-man game with Murray and Jokic. Chemistry, obviously, extending to Aaron Gordon and Christian Brown. DeMar DeRozan is definitely it's kind of a get out of jail free card a little bit with the bench to where, and who knows, maybe he ends up starting at some point this season, or maybe they really prefer him kind of as a super sub. But either way, he's someone who can kind of stagger the non-Jokic minutes and get you through those painful 12 minutes a game that everyone in Denver dreads every year. So like they're going to be in the mix. I have a really hard time seeing them winning the West or even getting to the Western Conference Finals right now if OKC and San Antonio are healthy. But I mean, like, I think they should win 50 games again. We'll see. It's a weirder season to evaluate for them because I think we've looked at them going into each of the last 4 years as a bona fide top tier championship contender. And this might be the first time that there's pretty heavy skepticism on that label.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time. And obviously, there's a difference between being a championship contender and then also reaching the NBA finals, right? There's a difference and a gap between the teams that are like, oh, we're going championship aspirations. We have a belief in this roster that we've curated, but also what is the actual sustainability of that, especially when you have the expectations of being one of the most expensive teams. And the Cleveland Cavaliers had to deal with that last year. It was you have to make it to the Eastern Conference Finals, although it took them 14 games just to get there and then get slaughtered by the New York Knicks in 4 games. You had to at least get there, and the organization can then say, hey, we finally made it back to the Eastern Conference Finals since 2018 without LeBron. That is what the expectation is from organizations and a fan base. And I'm not necessarily sure it's the same way for Denver because it's been more recent that they've won a championship. But you also don't want to feel like you're wasting the career or the prime of one of the best players that we've seen touch a basketball. But since we're talking about Nikola Jokic, I want to take that pin out of that conversation and get into the final two questions that I have for you on today's podcast, Bennett. Nikola Jokic, as we mentioned, said that he wants to be a Nugget forever, but he's also waiting until next summer to address his contract situation. He could sign a 5-year Supermax extension worth roughly $350 million at that point. But I think we also have to be honest about this. Nikola Jokic is not your typical NBA superstar. He's not necessarily worried about all the other things that other NBA players are. He doesn't particularly seem interested in the celebrity side of the NBA. He loves Serbia. He's there representing his country right now in FIBA. He loves his horses. He seems to genuinely like his life outside of basketball, which sometimes doesn't seem like the reality for some of these NBA stars. When you think about Nikola Jokic's future, do you think the normal NBA motivations, bigger market, bigger spotlight, chasing another star, chasing another ring, matter to him as much as they might to another superstar?
It's interesting because everything that you said is completely right. There is more of a, I guess, for lack of a better term, like priority on work-life balance for Jokic than we see with a lot of other stars. He goes on his rafting trip in Serbia with his friends every summer. He goes to his horse races. He has his hobbies outside of this. He's got 2 kids now. They love pool days, right? Like these are things that matter to him. He is also like he's an MFer of a competitor. Like he is extremely competitive and gets ornery when things aren't going well competitively. He's used to winning. He has his entire life. So, well, I guess not early in his career in Denver when he was coming off the bench as a second round pick. So he has kind of had more of a grasp on his superstar influence, I think, over the last few years, and that's something that he's recognized at least more. The Nuggets run by every transaction with him like that he is an integral part of them, feeling like they are making the right decisions for their franchise. But like he wants to win. What fascinates me, I do think he's gonna sign the contract next summer. Like I would be pretty surprised if he actually went, into free agency and had conversations with other teams, unless this season is like a complete disaster, in which case, the vultures will circle. But I think he'll sign the contract, and then the question will become, will these 5 years be his last contract in the NBA? Will he be someone who retires at, 37 instead of trying to go to 40 or whatever? Just kind of a fascinating element of it to me, but he's an interesting character. I don't think that LA or New York or those sorts of things appeal to him. So you're totally right about that. I think he feels very comfortable in Denver with his life here, and I think he's been pretty, introspective about that. Honestly, in recent years, he gave a pretty memorable press conference after he won his third MVP, where he was very open hearted, more so than you usually see him, just about kind of the community in Denver and the respect that people generally have for him when they see him in public with his family, kind of the peace that he is afforded by the people here. And that's not something that he would necessarily get anytime he showed his face in public in LA or something like that, right? So, that's not going to stop teams like the Lakers from making some calls if the Nuggets start 6-9 this season. But I don't think he's lying when he says that he wants to stay a Nugget for life and spend and be a one franchise superstar and play this thing out in Denver one way or the other.
Well, that makes my last question rather simple because you kind of answered it already, but there are already different murmurs of maybe a Greece owner trying to wheel Jokic away overseas and take and shorten his NBA career, or obviously the potential for Jokic to team up with lifelong friend Luka Doncic in Los Angeles. You just don't think that those are in the cards for Nikola Jokic in his career. You think more so than ever that he is more likely to re-sign with Denver and end his career as a Nugget for life?
I mean, look, never say never in the NBA. If Luca can get traded from Dallas to LA in the middle of the night, then anything is possible. I refuse to say definitively that this is happening, but I don't think the Panathinaikos thing is happening. I don't think Jokic will ever be a Laker or anything other than a Nugget in the NBA for that matter. The Greece thing is funny because last summer they essentially tried to poach Jonas Valanciunas out of his NBA contract as the Nuggets were in the process of finalizing a trade for him with Sacramento. It was kind of a subsequent move after the MPJ for Cam Johnson trade where they had the financial flexibility suddenly to flip Dario Saric at 5 million for Jonas at 10 million. And they were really excited about him coming in and being probably the best backup center that Jokic had had on the roster in several years. And as this was happening, Panathinaikos was basically trying to pull him away by offering him a lucrative 3-year contract to come to the EuroLeague while he was under contract in the NBA. And so it ends up being much ado about nothing where the Nuggets say, sorry, we're holding him to his NBA contract. Like that is in fact binding, and we traded for him because we want him to play on our team next season. It's just kind of funny that now Panathinaikos has decided to set their sights even higher on Jokic as a potential free agent after the Valanciunas thing didn't work out last summer. There's going to be a lot of that stuff in the next year. I think Nuggets fans are going to get pretty uncomfortable at times with this situation because they've largely avoided the superstar rumor mill with Jokic in the way that Bucks fans obviously didn't avoid with Giannis for 7 years leading up to that trade. Denver has had a charmed life with their franchise player here, and this is going to be the most uncomfortable, awkward feeling season that there's been with him, I think, at times.
Ben and I really appreciate you joining us today because I feel like you gave us different insight that we wouldn't have, not only to the Nikola Jokic saga that is to come next summer, but also into Peyton Watson, who the Cleveland Cavaliers fan base should really be listening to what Bennett has to say about what this newcomer is going to be bringing to the organization, especially because the Nuggets and the Cavaliers are taking vastly different paths, but there are some fascinating parallels between these two organizations right now, particularly when it comes to trying to build around an elite player while navigating an increasingly punishing salary cap environment.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's going to be different in Cleveland because Peyton in Denver was on a rookie scale contract, and the expectation he was kind of a wild card as far as no one knowing what to expect from him. But he was a fan favorite here. Like the fans really embraced not only kind of the electricity of his game, but his personality. He's an extremely bubbly, outgoing person. I think you're going to enjoy covering him for sure. It's harder for me to say definitively that he'll be a fan favorite in Cleveland just because the difference between getting paid under 5 million and 20 plus million is sizable, and this becomes the contract where you have to prove that you're worth the money you just got paid. So there's inherently that extra bit of pressure that can lead fans to turn on a guy a little bit more. But assuming he does live up to the money, I think Peyton's going to be immensely popular in Cleveland. He has a very infectious vibe. I think that he'll be generally well liked in the locker room. He's an exciting player, and he's a very friendly person. So it's going to be interesting to kind of see him interact with a new locker room, a new fan base, a new community, and all of that.
I think it's going to be an extremely fun season. And as we know in Cavs land, the fan base is very critical, but also like to have fun and be fair to their players as well. So, Bennett, again, I appreciate you hopping on. I'm excited for whenever Denver gets to come to Cleveland, and I can hopefully have you back on the podcast and we can reconvene on all the different topics that we covered today. But until then, let the fans and the listeners and the viewers know where they can find your work to stay tuned on everything covering the Denver Nuggets.
Yeah, just check out denverpost.com. Always putting up new content and everything, features, behind the scenes stuff. We try to be pretty robust in our coverage. You can follow me on Twitter at Bennett Durando. It's just my name, so pretty easy to find. Thanks for having me on, Ethan.
I appreciate you, Bennett. And again, I can't wait until next time. But with all that being said, that'll wrap up today's episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs insider and interact with Chris, me, and Jimmy by subscribing to Subtext. Sign up for a 14-day free trial or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word STOP. It's easy, but we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me, Chris, and Jimmy. This isn't just our podcast, it's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through Subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.